Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Kelly Canada. She's a senior consultant for sustainability at LMI, and Dr. Sharon Hayes is the chief technology officer at LMI. Good to have you both with us. And let's get right to this issue of sustainability, a big priority for the new administration. And in truth, it's been an issue for the government for some years running now. And that is the many assets that the government itself has that are susceptible to the effects of climate change. Maybe just give us a rundown of the scope of what we're talking about here, and then we can maybe discuss what the potential costs here are.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the climate-induced threats that are posed to the nation's infrastructure are truly broad. Sea level rise caused by melting glaciers leads to inundation of buildings, bases, launch pads, other facilities on coastlines. We know about severe hurricanes and the damage they cause, but climate change will also be responsible for more frequent and more freakish storms. So 100-year floods could now occur more like every decade. Consider the changes to the polar vortex that are possible that bring things like snow and freezing temperatures to states like Texas. On the other end of the spectrum, you have heat waves. Southwest last year saw temperatures regularly in the 110-degree range. Those can stretch power grids to the breaking point, make infrastructure like an asphalt runway unusable. So those are just a few, and the cost to society are somewhere in the tens to hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's just in the US. But I think just as important are some of the intangible costs. That includes certainly life and health, but also accomplishment of government missions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. A number of hazards that Sharon mentioned, and really from a federal government perspective, it's understanding what are the implications of those types of hazards. So that varies by the agency, by the type of mission that they're executing, and by the types of assets that they rely on in order to execute their mission. So, for example, in thinking of a hazard like hurricanes or major storms, of course, you've got that direct damage or impairment to the federal asset, very costly to repair or replace. But also, if I'm the Department of Defense, I'm dealing with weeks, if not months, of lost mission readiness. I have a diminished capacity to deploy equipment and aircraft and personnel and time. And then same hazard if I'm, let's say, Coast Guard or FEMA. I need to be planning for an increased need to provide and deploy disaster relief in the US as these events continue to occur with greater frequency and intensity. Same hazard, another client or another agency, if I'm, let's say, CDC or Department of Health and Human Services, there's going to be a need for more frequent real-time tracking and communication with the public to be able to increase their preparedness, to monitor the impacts of these types of events on things like water quality, as well as the spread of disease. So it gets very complex when you start to think about different federal missions, how they execute the missions, and then really how are they exposed to climate change.
I'm thinking that many of the pieces of infrastructure that the government owns and operates are not new. In fact, some of them are quite old and were built in a time when the climate was different and the patterns was different. I'm thinking, for example, right in downtown DC, the Tiber Creek runs right under the Treasury Department and IRS headquarters, and it sometimes manifests itself and a lot of damage happens. This could be happening more wide scale, I guess, in many, many locations, basically, is what we're facing here.
Absolutely. In fact, in the US, there's about 18,000 federal buildings that are within the 100-year floodplain, and their replacement value is over $80 billion. So yes, there is a lot of existing risk in existing facilities.
All right. So in terms of preparedness, I mean, you can't replace every building or take everything ever built and put it on 20-foot stilts. So what does preparedness consist of? What does it look like for something like the federal government with this gigantic number and diversity of assets that are at threat?
In thinking about preparedness and how the federal government just executes from day to day, fundamentally where the rubber meets the road and how agencies are operating is largely grounded in a lot of long established codes and standards. Everything from how you build a building and providing very specifics on what materials to use, how to manage rainfall at the site of that asset, how to evaluate flood risk to a facility or a house, or be able to price flood insurance, or even determine whether or not a site is actually suitable for development. And then also another example, how do you adequately account for the financial impact and losses to a federal asset when an event occurs? So fundamentally, good preparedness and a really great opportunity to use data analytics is using climate data, using future projections to actually update lots of these standards that are basically based on the fact that, you know, weather of the past and climate conditions of the past can be used to predict the future. And unfortunately, we know that that's no longer the case because climate change is occurring. And revising these types of codes and standards is really one of those greatest opportunities to help inject data analytics into improving federal preparedness.
And Sharon, what does some of that data look like? Because we have manifest weather data, the federal government itself produces ultimately all of the weather data, but then each individual location is so different and so unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data analytics are really important to climate resiliency and preparedness, in part because that preparedness starts with an understanding of the scope of the problem, as you said, not just globally, but at the place where impacts happen. So you can't simply just look at historical weather and understand what temperature highs and lows are going to be. What we're really dependent on are climate models, which are really a digital twin of the Earth's environment, and they're critical to understanding what to expect. So that really leads to some big data related challenges. One is the sheer volume of those data. What goes into those climate models, data from satellites, sea level, glacier size, CO2 in the atmosphere, ground based measurements, and the data that come out are massive, petabytes in size. So turning those data into actual insights, into actionable information at a local level is a major challenge. And doing that requires data analytics, new algorithms, automations, et cetera.
Now, very often in the federal government and the federal sector, these kinds of analyses or even programs built around them don't happen unless someone says you got to do it. Someone that has the power of the purse, say, for example. So, what do you think is a good organizational approach to ensure that this happens? Because it's maybe a priority at the White House, but it's a very localized reality to carry out.
Yeah, certainly more coordination between federal and state and local agencies is critical. And that's been a challenge. And I think that's in part been a challenge because some of the policy issues that are at issue here are really sticky. And the conversation hasn't been as robust in recent years as it probably needs to be to really facilitate that conversation.
Yeah. And I'd actually like to add there that I think just kind of a basic step is just generally agencies and the functional groups within agencies need just more basic climate literacy. You know, what is it? Like, what are the implications? You know, many of the things that I mentioned earlier. This is so critical because while there's a number of agencies like NASA and NOAA that are generating these massive data sets to kind of collectively improve our understanding of the science behind climate change, frankly, those are not the parts of the agency that need to improve their decision making based on that climate data. It's the people that sit at the top of agencies. They're formulating budgets, they're making procurement and asset management decisions, monitoring and mitigating risk at the enterprise level. There's so many different functional groups at every agency, again, that need to have that basic understanding of what climate change is so that they can make better decisions to help their agency, its programs, its assets, and certainly to protect its people. And then I'll also mention kind of hand in hand with the climate literacy is also more understanding around environmental justice issues. That is certainly a priority of this administration, as it should be. And at these same federal decision makers that will be issuing new guidance, policies, we certainly want to make sure that that includes the protection of and opportunities for marginalized communities.
But getting to the operation of agencies themselves, the agency heads are ultimately responsible for continuity of operation. So maybe this is something they need to build into the budget and fiscal reporting process too, to account for what they need to do for preparedness.
Certainly, and some of these challenges really can be addressed at the executive level. So we've seen at the onset of this administration a number of executive orders and other mechanisms where the White House can really direct agencies to take those kinds of steps. So we're already seeing that kind of activity.
Yeah. However, the kind of the fiscal risk of climate change is actually not a new issue for the federal government. In fact, the U.S. Government Accountability Office has its high risk list, and the fiscal challenges of climate change has been on that that list for a number of years. And in recent times, kind of the federal progress in helping to resolve that risk has actually been downgraded. That report actually does a really good job of kind of laying out why it's so critical and why there is such a fiscal risk to the federal government based upon the programs that it provides to the American people. That includes, the National Flood Insurance and Crop Insurance Program. Those are programs that are taking on more and more debt because federal payouts to cover losses are exceeding premiums that these programs are collecting. Certainly, we've already mentioned the government's role in providing disaster aid and coordinated response is something that's going to increase over time. So there are just a lot of compelling evidence for why it's such a fiscal challenge for the government to solve quickly moving forward.
Yeah, I guess the more liable the government is for some of these programs, like you say, pension guarantees or crop insurance or flood insurance, whatever the case might be, the more they need to expand their notion of what could happen that could cause something in a fiscal sense, to say nothing of an operational sense. Fair way to put it?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, where you would want to see this type of information reported and disclosed to the American people and things like financial reports and risk profiles, largely in the past, it's been absent. So now we need to give federal managers and decision makers the information that they need so that they can better and more adequately report these challenges and get the resources to deal with them.
I mean, I think a key issue here is the cycle in which these decisions are made. And in the federal government, the annual budget cycle makes it really easy just to look at near-term impacts, and dollars are precious everywhere. So when you're thinking about climate change, you're really thinking about addressing and mitigating an issue that might not manifest itself for a decade or more. And that's a big challenge in the federal space.
Okay, good food for thought on that note. We'll take a short break here. My guests are Dr. Sharon Hayes. She's the Chief Technology Officer at LMI, and Kelly Canada, Senior Consultant for Sustainability at LMI. And I'm Tom Temin. This discussion is Use a Data-Driven Approach to Reach Climate Resilience, sponsored by LMI here on Federal News Network.